It always begins with a morning that feels too ordinary to remember. In the spring of 1973, the town woke the way it always did, without fear, without urgency, without the faintest understanding that this particular morning would divide its history into before and after. The sun rose gently, pale and unremarkable, spilling light across quiet streets and front yards trimmed just enough to suggest care but not obsession. Birds moved through the air as they always had. Doors opened. Radios hummed softly. Coffee brewed. Life continued on schedule. 17 children woke up inside that calm. Some of them had alarm clocks. Some were shaken awake by tired parents running late. One overslept and skipped breakfast. Another refused to wear the jacket their mother insisted on, even though the air still carried a trace of night's chill. There were arguments about homework not finished, about shoes misplaced, about how long it takes to brush teeth properly. There were kisses on foreheads given automatically, without ceremony, because no one believed this would be the last time. Backpacks were slung over small shoulders. Lunch pails were packed with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, apples that would brown by noon. Notes scribbled quickly. Be good today. I love you. Some children walked alone. Others walked in pairs or loose clusters, drifting together and apart as they followed the same familiar route. They knew these roads better than their own house numbers. They had walked them in rain, in snow, in the thick heat of summer. Nothing about the path felt dangerous. Nothing about the distance felt long. Parents watched from windows and door frames, not because they were afraid, but because it felt right to look up. Then the doors closed. Cars pulled away. The day officially began. By mid-morning, the town was functioning exactly as expected. Classrooms filled with the children who arrived. Attendance sheets were marked. A few empty seats were noticed, but not immediately questioned. Kids get sick. Kids run late. Kids miss buses. It happens. But as the morning crept forward, something subtle began to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to register as discomfort. Teachers realized more names than usual were unanswered. 17 names, scattered across grades, classrooms, and buildings. Too many to be coincidence. Too many to ignore. Calls were made. Secretaries dialed numbers from memory, fingers moving faster with each unanswered ring. Some parents were confused. Others laughed nervously and said their child had left hours ago. A few went silent, standing in kitchens where time suddenly felt thick and heavy. By lunchtime, concern hardened into fear. Parents left work early. Some ran. Some drove too fast. They checked neighbors' houses, retraced steps, walked routes their children should have already finished twice over. Shoes scuffed the pavement where small feet had passed just hours earlier. Names were called out into spaces that refused to answer. The children did not come home. Afternoon settled in, slow and unbearable. The town sounds changed. Doors slammed. Engines started and stopped. Voices overlapped, louder now, sharper. There were questions no one could answer. When did you last see them? What were they wearing? Did they say anything unusual? Did you notice anyone strange? But the strangest thing was what hadn't happened. No one had heard screaming. No one had seen a struggle. There were no abandoned backpacks. No torn clothing, no signs of panic along the roads. The paths remained exactly as they had been that morning. Quiet, intact, indifferent. It was as if the children had simply stepped out of the world between one street and the next. Police arrived as the sun began its slow descent. Flashing lights reflected off windows that had never seen them before. Officers asked questions carefully, then urgently. The word missing started appearing in conversations, heavy and foreign. Parents clung to hope because the alternative was too vast a name. As night approached, fear took on a new texture. Searchlights cut through trees. Volunteers formed lines, walking shoulder to shoulder through fields and wooded edges, calling names into the dark. Dogs sniffed the ground, circling, confused. The air grew colder, and jackets pulled tighter around shaking bodies. Every sound, a snapped twig, a distant echo, sent hearts racing. Still, there were no answers. By midnight, exhaustion set in, but sleep did not come. Kitchens stayed lit. Phones stayed silent. Mothers sat at tables staring at clocks that refused to move fast enough. Fathers walked outside again and again, as if motion itself could undo what had already happened. The realization arrived slowly and all at once. Something irreversible had occurred. This was no longer a delay, no longer a misunderstanding, no longer a day gone wrong that could be corrected by morning. 17 children had vanished between home and school, along roads that had never demanded caution before. And the most terrifying part wasn't what the town knew. It was what it didn't. There was no moment to point to, no scream frozen in memory, no clear beginning to the nightmare. Just a blank space where certainty used to live. Just a morning that never truly finished. Years later, people would try to pinpoint when everything changed. Some would say it was the first unanswered phone call. Others would say it was the moment the sun set, and the children still hadn't returned. But for many, the shift happened earlier than that, quietly and visibly, when the town learned that routine offers no protection, and that safety is often just a story we tell ourselves because we need to believe the world is paying attention. That morning in 1973 looked like every other morning before it. That is what made it unbearable. Because when 17 children walked out the door and never arrived where they were supposed to be, the town learned a truth it would spend decades trying to survive. Disappearance doesn't announce itself. It slips in unnoticed, wearing the disguise of normal life. And by the time you realize something is wrong, the silence has already taken hold. It was too clean, too distant, a figure that could be written on paper, repeated in news reports, spoken by officials who had learned to keep their voices steady. But the town knew better. 17 was not a number. It was a collection of absences, each one shaped differently, each one cutting into the community in its own quiet way. People started saying the names instead. They said them slowly, carefully, as if pronunciation itself might keep the children present. The names were spoken in kitchens, in school hallways, in church pews. They were written on signs taped to telephone poles, on flyers pressed into trembling hands. Each name carried weight, because behind every one of them was a life that had been in motion only days before. There was a girl who always counted her steps on the way to school, whispering numbers under her breath until she reached the front gate. No one knew why she did it, only that it calmed her. Her mother remembered finding her shoes by the door that morning, perfectly lined up, laces tucked inside like she planned to use them again the next day. There was a boy who walked slower than everyone else, not because he was tired, but because he hated school and believed that if he delayed long enough, something might happen to change his mind. He had told his friends that morning he might skip class. That memory haunted them later, because skipping class implied choice, and choice implied agency. But whatever happened on that road stripped him of both. 2 siblings disappeared minutes apart. One had left early, eager to see friends. The other followed later, annoyed at being rushed. Their parents replayed the morning endlessly, wondering if timing had sealed their fate, if 5 minutes earlier or later might have rewritten everything. One child had been excited about a spelling test. Another was nervous about gym class. One had a loose tooth they couldn't stop touching with their tongue. These details surfaced not because they explained anything, but because they were all that remained. The school kept their desks empty at first. Teachers couldn't bring themselves to assign the seats to anyone else. Books stayed inside desks, untouched. Jackets hung on hooks where no one reached for them. Every empty space became a reminder that absence has a shape. It occupies room. It demands attention, even when you try to look away. As weeks passed, some parents asked for the desks to be cleared. Others begged for them to stay. There was no right decision. Only choices weighted with grief. What made the loss unbearable wasn't just that the children were gone. It was that they were gone without context. There were no final words, no moments to interpret, no scenes to reconstruct. Their lives had been interrupted mid-sentence. Birthdays came and went. Cakes were bought and left untouched. Gifts sat wrapped in closets because opening them felt like an admission that time was moving forward without permission. Holidays arrived, loud and bright, clashing violently with the quiet that now lived inside homes. For some parents, the worst moments came unexpectedly. A shoe left under a bed. A jacket that still smelled faintly like soap and childhood. A height mark penciled on a doorframe that would never be updated. These weren't relics. They were accusations. Proof that life had been in motion, growing, changing, until it wasn't. The town tried to hold all 17 stories at once, but it was impossible. Grief doesn't scale neatly. Some children were remembered more loudly than others, simply because of circumstance. Some families spoke to reporters. Others shut their doors and disappeared from public view. Silence became its own form of mourning. There were moments when hope surged irrationally. Someone thought they saw a familiar face in another town. A rumor spread about a child matching a description miles away. Parents learned to live on the edge of anticipation, hearts racing at every phone call. And then the letdown, again and again, until hope itself began to feel dangerous. The children, frozen in memory, never aged. In people's minds, they remained exactly as they had been that morning. Faces fixed at a certain expression, voices caught at particular pitch. While their classmates grew taller, deeper voiced, more distant, the missing remained unchanged. This created a quiet dissonance. They belonged to the present and the past simultaneously, existing nowhere except in memory. As time passed, the town's language shifted. People stopped saying when they come back and started saying if. That single word carried an enormous weight. It marked a moment when hope became conditional, when belief fractured just enough to let doubt seep in. Yet even then, letting go felt like betrayal. To accept the possibility that the children were gone forever felt like abandoning them a second time. Parents held on to routines long after they no longer made sense, setting places at the table, leaving porch lights on, keeping bedroom doors slightly ajar. These were not gestures of denial. They were acts of loyalty. The individuality of each child became more pronounced as the years passed. Stories were told and retold, refining details, preserving quirks. One always hummed while walking. One hated stepping on cracks. One had a habit of waving back even after the person waving had stopped. These fragments became sacred. They were proof that the children were not just victims of mystery, but people who had once moved through the world with their own rhythms. And yet, there was a cruel sameness to how they were remembered. All 17 were forever defined by the same unfinished moment. No graduations, no first jobs, no adult photographs to soften memory's edges. Their stories ended where most stories are only beginning. The town learned that numbers are easier to carry than names, but names are harder to forget. And so people kept saying them, long after reporters stopped asking, long after searches slowed, long after the roads returned to something resembling normal. Because as long as the names were spoken, the children were not entirely lost. They existed in the spaces between conversations, in the quiet pauses where memory intrudes without warning. 17 silences, each one distinct, each one echoing differently. And together, they form a presence that never truly left. At first, it still felt temporary, an extension of concern rather than panic. Parents walked quickly but purposefully, calling out names with the confidence that answers were nearby. Neighbors joined in without being asked. Someone brought flashlights. Someone else brought coffee. It had the shape of community, of people coming together to solve a problem that still seemed solvable. But as hours stretched and nothing was found, that shape began to distort. By the second day, the town no longer moved in ones and twos. It moved in groups. Volunteers lined up along the edges of fields, hands almost brushing, eyes trained on the ground ahead. They were told to look for anything. Footprints, scraps of clothing, disturbed soil, but most didn't know what they were hoping to see. Every discovery carried the risk of ending hope entirely. Police expanded the perimeter again and again, as if distance itself might produce answers. Roads leading out of town were checked. Nearby woods were combed until the paths blurred together. Dogs were brought in, their handlers tense, watching for any sign of certainty. The dogs circled, sniffed, hesitated. Sometimes they followed a trail for a few minutes, only to lose it abruptly, leaving everyone standing in silence, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. Sleep became optional. Parents who hadn't closed their eyes in days still showed up at dawn, faces drawn and hollow, refusing to rest while their children were still missing. Exhaustion settled into their bones, but adrenaline kept them upright. The search was no longer just about finding the children. It had become the only way to endure the waiting. As the effort intensified, so did the fear. Every place that had once felt harmless was re-examined under new lens. Storm drains were opened. Culverts were crawled through by officers on hands and knees. Abandoned sheds were forced open. Old construction sites, long forgotten and overgrown, were suddenly alive with movement, lights cutting through dust and darkness. These places had always existed, but now they felt accusatory, as if they had been watching quietly all along. The town's rhythm collapsed under the weight of constant motion. Businesses closed early. Schools suspended classes. Church basements turned into coordination centers. Maps spread across folding tables, red marks multiplying with each passing hour. People spoke in hushed tones, not out of respect, but because raising their voices felt like tempting fate. There were moments, brief, cruel moments, when the search seemed close to breaking through. A shoe print that looked too small to belong to an adult. A scrap of fabric snagged on a branch. A child's handwriting found in a notebook that didn't belong to any of the missing. Each discovery sent a ripple of energy through the crowd, hearts lifting just enough to hurt when the lead collapsed into nothing. Hope became volatile. Some parents clung to it desperately, interpreting every delay as proof that their child was alive somewhere waiting. Others began to fear the opposite, that the longer the search lasted, the less likely it was to end in relief. This divide created quiet tension. People didn't argue openly, but you could see in their eyes, in the way they reacted to updates. Too much optimism felt naive. Too much realism felt cruel. Law enforcement struggled with the same uncertainty. There was no single theory guiding the search. No clear crime scene. No timeline that made sense. The children had vanished across different routes, at slightly different times, without witnesses. The scale of it defied easy explanation, and that uncertainty seeped into every decision. Where do you look when you don't know what you're looking for? As days passed, the search expanded beyond geography and into memory. Officers interviewed parents, teachers, classmates. They asked about habits, routines, strangers, anything out of the ordinary. The same questions were asked again and again, not because new answers were expected, but because repetition felt like action. It felt like progress, even when none existed. Parents replayed the morning obsessively, searching for overlooked details. A passing car, a sound dismissed too quickly, a moment of hesitation before a door closed. Memory became both refuge and torment, offering endless possibilities but no certainty. The physical search took its toll. Volunteers returned home with scraped hands, mud-stained clothes, and eyes dulled by disappointment. Some stopped coming, unable to endure the emotional weight any longer. Others doubled down, arriving earlier, staying later, driven by a sense that leaving meant giving up. By the end of the first week, the town looked different. Not visibly. Houses still stood, roads still stretched out, but something intangible had shifted. The air felt heavier. Conversations felt cautious. Laughter sounded out of place, almost offensive. People learned to read each other's expressions quickly, gauging whether it was safe to speak or better to stay silent. The search, once fueled by urgency, began to feel endless. Authorities brought in outside resources, experts who had seen similar cases, though none quite like this. Each new arrival sparked brief hope, followed by quiet disappointment when they, too, found nothing. The absence of evidence became evidence itself, suggesting planning, intention, something far beyond a simple accident. And still, the roads gave nothing back. The very spaces that carried the children so reliably now refused to yield even the smallest clue. It was as if the town had been erased in sections, memories scraped clean between point A and point B. Eventually, the tone shifted again. The frantic pace slowed, replaced by something more methodical, more resigned. Search areas were revisited not because anyone expected a different result, but because leaving them unchecked felt irresponsible. Hope thinned into obligation. For the parents, this transition was devastating. The search had been exhausting, but it had also been purposeful. As long as it continued at full force, there was the illusion that something could still be done. When it slowed, when the urgency faded from official voices, it felt like abandonment. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. The search had consumed everything it could and still come up empty. The town had thrown itself into the effort with everything it had, time, energy, belief, and in return, it had received only silence. That silence lingered long after the searchlights were turned off, long after the volunteers stopped lining up at dawn. It settled into homes, into conversations, into the spaces where answers should have been. The search did not end with resolution. It ended with exhaustion, with unanswered questions, and with community forced to confront the possibility that some mysteries do not yield to effort alone, no matter how desperately they are pursued. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Conversations shifted tone. Whispers replaced questions. The absence of evidence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured suspicion, fear, and the human need to make sense of the unbearable. When there are no facts to hold on to, imagination becomes dangerous. People began asking a different kind of question. Not where, but who. At first, suspicion aimed outward. Strangers were easier to fear. A truck that had been seen driving through town that morning suddenly became important. Someone remembered it being blue. Someone else insisted it was green. No one could recall the license plate. A traveling salesman who had stopped for gas was questioned for hours. His life dissected because he'd been passing through at the wrong time. When he was cleared, relief was mixed with disappointment. The town didn't want innocence. It wanted certainty. Outsiders became symbols rather than people. Anyone who didn't belong, who didn't have a long family history or familiar face, felt the weight of unspoken accusation. Glances lingered too long. Conversation stopped abruptly when unfamiliar ears entered the room. The idea that the children had been taken by someone unknown offered a strange comfort. It implied the danger had come from outside, not from within. But when that theory failed to hold, the focus shifted closer to home. Neighbors began reevaluating each other through a lens warped by fear. The quiet man who lived alone near one of the routes. The woman who worked odd hours and didn't attend church. The teenager who skipped school and hung around after dark. Ordinary differences were recast as potential warning signs. Past interactions were replayed, stripped of context, reshaped to fit a darker narrative. The town learned how quickly familiarity could curdle into mistrust. Rumors spread faster than facts ever had. Someone claimed they'd seen a child talking to a man by the road. Someone else insisted the same man had been miles away. Stories grew with each retelling. Details added not because they were true, but because they made the story feel complete. Fear demanded coherence, even if it had to invent it. Law enforcement tried to manage the chaos, but they were not immune to it. With no clear suspect, every lead was pursued aggressively. Interviews stretched for hours. Homes were searched. Alibis were scrutinized. Innocent inconsistencies, misremembered times, forgotten details, were treated as potential cracks in a carefully constructed lie. People who had never been questioned by police before found themselves under harsh lights, answering questions they didn't understand. For some, the scrutiny never fully lifted. Even after being cleared, suspicion lingered like a stain. Whispers followed them to grocery stores, to church pews, to school events. Children of the accused felt it too, sensing the shift in how other kids looked at them, spoke to them, avoided them. The disappearance didn't just steal 17 children. It poisoned relationships that had taken years to build. Families of the missing were not spared this tension. Grief does not make people gentle. It sharpens emotions, narrows tolerance, and magnifies perceived slights. Some parents became convinced that someone in town knew more than they were saying. They watched faces closely during meetings, searching for guilt in averted eyes or trembling hands. Every silence felt suspicious. Every denial felt rehearsed. Arguments erupted in places that had once been safe. Community meetings meant to share updates devolved into accusations. Voices cracked. People cried, not just for children, but for the unbearable pressure of living among unanswered questions. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned, and few people felt capable of offering it. The media's presence only intensified the atmosphere. Reporters arrived with cameras and leading questions, eager for a narrative that could be framed and broadcast. They asked about suspects, about tensions, about theories. Each broadcast planted new ideas, new fears. The town watched itself portrayed as a place of secrets and shadows, and slowly began to believe it. Speculation became a form of participation. People who had felt powerless during the search now felt useful by contributing theories. They compared notes, connected dots that didn't exist, filled in gaps with assumption. It was easier to believe in a hidden villain than to accept that something so terrible could occur without explanation. Yet with every accusation that fell apart, the pool of suspects shrank, and the implications grew darker. If it wasn't a stranger, and it wasn't the obvious outsider, then who was left? The thought that the answer might be someone trusted, someone woven into daily life, was too heavy to confront directly, and so suspicion hovered without settling, poised in the air without landing anywhere solid. Over time, the town grew tired of suspecting. The emotional cost of constant vigilance was too high. Some people withdrew entirely, limiting contact, avoiding conversation. Others doubled down on normalcy, pretending nothing had changed, as if ignoring the tension might dissolve it. Neither approach brought relief. What remained was a fractured community, bound together by loss but divided by fear. Years later, people would reflect on this period with discomfort. They would admit quietly that they had said things they regretted, believed things without proof, looked at neighbors with eyes shaped by panic rather than reason. They would acknowledge that the mystery had turned them against one another, eroding the very foundation that had once made the town feel safe. The absence of a clear suspect did more than stall the investigation. It transformed the town into a place where everyone was both victim and potential villain, where trust was conditional and innocence had to be proven, where the question who could do this echoed endlessly, unanswered, reshaping relationships long after the initial fear had faded. In the end, the suspects without faces left a deeper scar than any single accusation ever could, because they forced the town to confront a truth it was not prepared to face, that sometimes the greatest damage of mystery isn't crime itself, but the way uncertainty dismantles the bonds that hold a community together, slowly, quietly, and almost completely. That was what people said, often with good intentions and no understanding of how hollow the word sounded. Time heals. Time moves on. Time softens the edges. But in this town, time did something else entirely. It stretched the pain out, thinned it, spread it across years until it became part of the air people breathed without noticing. The weeks after the search slowed felt heavier than the days of chaos. When there was no longer a reason to wake up before dawn and join search lines, parents were left alone with silence. The adrenaline faded, and in its place came a numb exhaustion that sleep could not fix. Mornings arrived anyway. Coffee still brewed. Clocks still ticked. But nothing felt anchored anymore. The town resumed its routines out of necessity, not comfort. Schools reopened. Stores returned to regular hours. Children who remained were walked to class under watchful eyes, their parents hovering longer than before, hands reluctant to let go. Teachers tried to teach, but attention drifted. Every empty chair pulled focus, a quiet reminder that something fundamental had been broken. As months passed, the disappearance stopped being the first thing people talked about, but it never stopped being the first thing they thought about. For the families, grief didn't follow a clean path. There was no funeral, no grave, no moment to mark the transition from presence to absence. Their children were not gone in a way that could be mourned traditionally. They were suspended somewhere between alive and dead, and that ambiguity refused to loosen its grip. Some parents clung to hope with unwavering intensity. They followed up on every rumor, every supposed sighting, no matter how thin. They traveled to nearby towns when someone claimed to have seen a child matching a description. They kept lists of possibilities, scenarios that allowed for survival. As long as there was no proof of death, hope felt like a responsibility. Others found hope unbearable. The constant cycle of anticipation and disappointment became too much to endure. For them, imagine their child alive somewhere, suffering, alone, was worse than imagining an end. These parents lived in a different kind of pain, one marked by guilt for wanting certainty, even when certainty might be devastating. The divide was invisible but profound. Friends who once supported each other began to drift apart, not out of conflict, but because their grief moved in different directions. What comforted one parent could wound another, There were no shared scripts for this kind of loss. Years passed, and the town aged around the absence. New families move in, unfamiliar with the story except as a whispered legend. Old residents moved away, unable to remain in a place where every street corner carried memory. Houses changed hands. Bedrooms once filled with posters and toys were repainted, repurposed, stripped of their history by people who never knew what had been lost there. For some parents, leaving was a form of survival. For others, staying felt like loyalty. They remained in the same homes, walked the same roads, kept the same routines. They did not want to be far from the last place their child had been seen. Distance felt like betrayal. Even as decades passed, they measured their lives by that final morning. Everything categorized as before or after. Anniversaries became particularly cruel. Each year, the date returned with quiet insistence, regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it publicly. Some families gathered privately, lighting candles, speaking names into the air. Others avoided the date entirely, refusing to give it power. The town itself struggled with how to remember, whether memorials would heal or reopen wounds. Children who had been classmates grew into adults. They graduated, married, had children of their own. Some left town and rarely looked back. Others stayed, haunted by the memory of friends who never grew up alongside them. Survivors' guilt settled in quietly, surfacing in unexpected moments, during milestones that should have been shared. The missing children remained unchanged in memory. Photographs faded. Hairstyles froze in time. Clothing locked them into a specific decade. While the world moved forward, they stayed suspended in 1973, forever the age they were when they disappeared. This created a strange dissonance. Parents aging beyond their children. Siblings growing older than the brothers or sisters they once followed to school. The case lingered in official records, technically unsolved, periodically revisited and then set aside again. Investigators came and went. Files were reopened, reviewed, reorganized. New theories surfaced, then collapsed under scrutiny. Each renewed effort sparked cautious attention, followed by familiar disappointment when nothing changed. Over time, the disappearance became part of the town's identity. It was mentioned in passing, referenced indirectly, carried like a scar no one wanted to touch. People learned to live with it, but living with something does not mean making peace with it. The phrase "time heals" rang increasingly hollow. What time actually did was normalize the absence. It made it possible to go grocery shopping without crying, to attend school events without scanning every face, to laugh without immediate guilt. But beneath that adaptation lay something unresolved, something quietly corrosive. For the parents who lived long enough to see decades pass, the waiting became its own form of endurance. They learned how to exist alongside unanswered questions, how to wake up each day knowing that resolution might never come. Some found purpose in advocacy, in keeping their children's stories alive. Others retreated into private worlds, conserving energy for small circles that felt safe. What united them was a refusal to forget. Even as memories softened around the edges, even as details blurred, the core remained sharp. Their children had left for school and never returned. That fact did not change, no matter how many years passed. Time did not heal the wound. It taught the town how to carry it. And in doing so, it revealed a difficult truth, that some losses are not meant to be resolved, only endured, quietly shaping the lives they touch until absence becomes a permanent companion rather than a temporary state. The roads were repaved. Streetlights were upgraded. New signage appeared where old metal posts had once leaned at awkward angles. Children still walked to school, though fewer did so alone. Life had layered itself over the past so thoroughly that, on the surface, there was little to suggest anything had ever gone wrong. But beneath that surface, the town carried another version of itself. It existed quietly, invisibly, in places most people never thought to look, beneath asphalt and soil, beneath buildings constructed long after the disappearance, beneath assumptions that whatever mattered most could be seen. When the case was revisited years later, quietly without fanfare, it wasn't driven by new witnesses or confessions. It was driven by paper. Old maps, faded blueprints, infrastructure records pulled from storage rooms that smelled like dust and neglect. A pattern began to emerge. The town had undergone rapid development in the decades before 1973. Expansion happened quickly, sometimes hastily. Drainage systems were installed to manage flooding from nearby fields. Utility tunnels were dug and sealed. Construction corridors were planned, altered, abandoned. Responsibility passed between contractors, agencies, and administrations, leaving behind gaps in documentation. No one had ever needed to reconcile those gaps before. Investigators began noticing inconsistencies, places where records didn't align with what existed on the ground. Tunnels that appeared on old plans but not on newer ones. Sections of drainage that seemed to vanish beneath streets that had since been widened. Dead ends that were never officially closed, simply forgotten. At the time of the disappearance, these spaces had been considered mundane, functional, unremarkable. They were not destinations, only passages. Places meant to move water, cables, materials, never people. But the idea took hold slowly, unsettlingly. What if they had been accessible? Not fully open, not obvious, just accessible enough. The realization reframed the entire geography of the town. The routes children took to school, especially the shortcuts, often ran alongside these systems. Shallow canals, culverts, maintenance access points hidden by brush. Features that blended into the environment so completely they became invisible to those who weren't looking for them. And in 1973, no one had been looking. Former construction workers were interviewed, men now retired, their memories fragmented by time. Some recalled working on projects that were rushed. Others remembered sealing off sections temporarily, intending to return later. A few admitted, reluctantly, that corners were cut, that documentation wasn't always precise. Not because of malice, because of momentum. The town had been growing, and growth does not always pause to reflect. As these conversations unfolded, the idea of a town beneath the town stopped feeling metaphorical. It became literal. A network of forgotten spaces running parallel to daily life, unnoticed because they were never meant to be part of anyone's story. The emotional weight of this possibility was immense. If the children had vanished into these hidden spaces, it meant they had not traveled far. They had not crossed state lines or disappeared into distant anonymity. They had been close, painfully close, while families searched outward, assuming distance rather than depth. This realization brought no comfort. It reframed the past with cruel clarity. Every step taken during the search, every mile covered, every border crossed in pursuit of answers, it all suddenly felt misdirected. The truth, if this theory held, had been beneath their feet the entire time. The town's residents reacted with a mix of disbelief and dread. Some rejected the idea outright. It felt too horrific, too intimate. Others accepted it immediately, sensing that it explained what nothing else had. The lack of witnesses, the absence of struggle, the way the children seemed to vanish without disrupting the world above them. If something had existed just out of sight, just beyond awareness, it could have swallowed 17 lives without ever announcing itself. This perspective also forced a reckoning with responsibility. No villain fit neatly into this narrative. No single person to blame. Instead, there was a system, imperfect, neglected, poorly documented. Decisions made years earlier without consideration for future consequences. Spaces left unmonitored because no one imagined they needed to be. The danger, if it existed, had been built gradually, unintentionally. Investigators began mapping the underground as thoroughly as they once had the roads above. Modern technology allowed for scans and surveys that hadn't been possible in the 1970s. Ground-penetrating equipment revealed anomalies, voids where none should have been, irregular structures hidden beneath layers of development. Each discovery carried a strange duality. On one hand, it offered the possibility of answers. On the other, it confirmed that the town had been living atop secrets it never knew it had. The phrase hidden in plain sight took on new meaning. This wasn't about someone hiding evidence. It was about everyone overlooking what had always been there. For families of the missing, this theory reopened wounds that time had only partially dulled. Some felt a surge of anger. How could something so significant have been ignored? How could the search have missed an entire layer of reality? Others felt something closer to resignation. It fit too well. It explained too much. But explanations are not the same as truth. The underground theory didn't provide names, motives, or timelines. It offered context, not closure. It suggested a mechanism, not a story. And stories are what people crave when trying to survive loss. Still, once the idea existed, it could not be erased. The town was no longer just streets and buildings and memories. It was a layered place, carrying both what was visible and what was buried. A place where absence might not mean distance, but concealment, where disappearance might not require escape, only access. People began to look at their surroundings differently. Storm drains were no longer background noise during rainstorms. Construction zones felt heavier, more deliberate. Even sidewalks carried a sense of unease, as the solidity itself could no longer be trusted. The town beneath the town had always been there, but now it demanded to be acknowledged, and with that acknowledgement came a chilling understanding. The past had not been lost. It had been sealed, layered over, waiting for someone to look down instead of out. What remained was a question of whether anyone was prepared for what might be found when they finally did. It began with confusion. A construction crew arrived early one morning to prepare a site that had been approved months earlier, a redevelopment project meant to modernize part of the town that had been overlooked for years. The plans were routine. Dig here, reinforce there, replace what was old with something clean and efficient. Progress neatly scheduled. At first, everything unfolded as expected. Machines broke through layers of asphalt and soil that had not been disturbed in decades. The ground resisted in familiar ways. Compact earth, scattered debris, the occasional reminder what had once stood there before being paved over. Then something felt wrong. A worker noticed a hollow where there shouldn't have been one. Not a sinkhole, not a collapse, just a subtle give beneath the machinery. The sound changed, too. The dull resistance of earth gave way to something emptier, quieter. Work paused. Engines shut off. People stood still, listening, as if the ground itself might explain what it was hiding. At first, they assumed it was an undocumented utility space. That happened more often than anyone liked to admit. Old tunnels, outdated drainage corridors, forgotten infrastructure from earlier development phases. The kind of thing that slowed projects but rarely surprised anyone. But as the crew exposed more of the space, it became clear this wasn't just a technical inconvenience. The opening led into a sealed passage, one that did not appear on the modern plans. The edges were reinforced, deliberately constructed, not the result of erosion or collapse. Dust coated everything, thick enough to suggest decades of stillness. Someone made a call, then another. Work stopped completely. When officials arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations grew quieter. Movements became cautious, deliberate. Flashlights replaced overhead sun, beams cutting through darkness that had not been disturbed since long before anyone on site had been born. No one spoke the thought out loud, but it was there. This place had been hidden. As more of the structure was revealed, it became clear that it wasn't a single chamber, but part of something larger, an extension of the underground systems investigators had begun mapping years earlier. Only this section had been sealed in a way that suggested finality, not neglect. Closed off, forgotten, left behind intentionally or otherwise. The realization settled slowly, heavily. This wasn't progress uncovering history. It was progress colliding with it. Authorities secured the site immediately. Barriers went up. The area was cleared. Phones buzzed with messages that carried a weight none of them needed to explain. Word traveled quickly, not through headlines at first, but through tone, through the way people spoke when they said there had been a discovery. By the time officials confirmed that the space would be examined as part of the long unsolved case, the town was already holding its breath. For residents who had lived there long enough, the feeling was familiar and unbearable. It was the same sensation they felt decades earlier. Hope and dread intertwined so tightly, they were indistinguishable. The idea that answers might finally surface came paired with the fear of what those answers would demand. Inside the space, time behaved differently. Dust lay undisturbed. Air felt stale, heavy with the absence of movement. Every step echoed, not loudly, but with a quiet insistence, as if the structure itself remembered being used for something it could no longer explain. Investigators moved carefully, documenting everything. They did not rush. This was not a crime scene in the traditional sense. It was a threshold between eras, between ignorance and possibility. Every detail mattered because context was all they had left. What they found did not announce itself dramatically. There were no immediate revelations, no single object that explained everything at once. Instead, there were indications, signs that the space had once been accessible, that it had served a function beyond what official records suggested. Modifications that didn't align with standard infrastructure design. Evidence of human presence, long removed but not entirely erased. Enough to change the conversation. News of the discovery broke carefully, almost reluctantly. Officials avoided specifics. Families were notified privately before details reached the public. The town listened closely to every word, parsing language for meaning, for reassurance, for warning. Construction workers were told they would not be returning to the site. For them, the experience lingered in quieter ways. They spoke about the moment the ground gave way, about the silence that followed, about the feeling that they had interrupted something that wanted to remain undisturbed. None of them had expected their day's work to intersect with a 50-year-old tragedy. As the investigation progressed, the space became a focal point, not just physically, but emotionally. People gathered nearby, standing behind barriers, staring at an ordinary patch of land that now carried extraordinary weight. Some brought flowers, some brought photographs, some brought nothing but themselves, as if proximity alone might offer clarity. For the families of the missing, the waiting returned in full force. Phones sat within reach at all times. Sleep fractured. Memories resurfaced with renewed intensity. The possibility that their children had been close, so close, all along was almost too much to bear. It reframed decades of grief, forcing to confront a past that suddenly felt unfinished again. Investigators worked methodically, aware that whatever they uncovered would ripple outward, reshaping not just the case, but the town's understanding of itself. Every step forward felt heavy with consequence. This was not just about solving a mystery. It was about reopening wounds that had scarred over imperfectly, about acknowledging that the ground beneath their lives had held secrets capable of swallowing an entire generation's sense of safety. As days passed, the site became quieter. The initial flurry of activity gave way to a measured, almost reverent pace. This was no longer about urgency. It was about care, about respecting the gravity of what might be revealed and the lives tied to it. The horrifying nature of the discovery was not in what could be seen. It was in what it implied, that the children had not vanished into nowhere, that they had not slipped beyond reach or memory, that the town had lived for 50 years above something unresolved, something waiting. And as the investigation continued, one truth became impossible to ignore. Progress had finally dug deep enough to disturb the past, and the past, once uncovered, was not going to remain silent. Piece by piece, layer by layer, the truth resisted being assembled into something clean or complete. For a town that had waited 50 years for clarity, the discovery offered something far more complicated. Confirmation without comfort, answers without relief. Inside the sealed space, investigators documented everything with deliberate restraint. They knew that what they were dealing with was not just evidence, but memory, fragile, charged, and capable of reshaping lives that had already been shaped by loss. Every object, every structural detail, every anomaly was treated not as proof, but as a question. The first confirmations were careful and controlled. Authorities acknowledged that the space had been accessible in the early 1970s, that it connected, indirectly, to routes children were known to take, that it had been sealed around the same period as the disappearances, though records explaining why were incomplete or missing entirely. Those statements alone were enough to destabilize the town. For decades, people had imagined the children being taken far away, across county lines, into anonymity, into stories that unfolded elsewhere. Now, the possibility that they had never left at all pressed down heavily on everyone who heard it. But confirmation did not mean completeness. There was no singular moment of recognition. No line drawn from disappearance to discovery that resolved everything neatly. Instead, investigators found evidence that suggested presence, but not explanation. Traces of activity, yes. Signs that the space had once been used in ways not officially recorded, but no clear narrative that accounted for all 17 children. Some remains were identified. The announcement came quietly, privately, before it reached the public. Families were notified one by one. Their reactions, as varied as their grief, had been over the decades. For some, the confirmation brought a strange, painful relief, an ending, at last, even if it was not the one they had hoped for. For others, it reopened wounds so deeply that closure felt like a myth invented by people who had never waited this long. Not all families received answers. That was the cruelest part. Only a portion of the missing could be accounted for with certainty. The others remained unlocated, their absence now reframed but no less profound. The discovery had narrowed the mystery, but it had not erased it. Instead, it introduced a new question, one perhaps more haunting than before. Why some and not all? Investigators were forced to confront the limits of what time had preserved. Decades underground had erased details that might once have told a fuller story. Materials degraded, context dissolved. What remained was enough to suggest what had happened, but not enough to explain how or why or by whose hand. The idea of a single perpetrator grew more uncertain. Nothing found pointed clearly to one individual. There were no personal effects linking a specific person to the space. No definitive evidence of sustained captivity. No clear signs of violence that could be conclusively interpreted. The absence of such markers complicated everything investigators thought they understood. This was not the kind of horror that announces itself. It was quieter, more systemic, rooted in access, opportunity, and neglect rather than overt brutality. The possibility that the children had fallen into a space created by oversight rather than intention was deeply unsettling. It suggested that tragedy did not always require malice. Sometimes, it only required indifference. Public reaction fractured along emotional lines. Some people demanded accountability. How could something like this exist unnoticed? How could records vanish? How could no one have been responsible for ensuring these spaces were secure? Others resisted that framing, uncomfortable with the idea that blame might rest not with villain, but with collective failure. The truth did not align cleanly with anyone's expectations. Families who had waited decades for justice now face a reality where justice was undefined. Who do you hold accountable for something that happened slowly, invisibly, across years of decisions made by people who may no longer be alive? The discovery forced the town to confront the difference between explanation and absolution. For those whose children were identified, the emotional aftermath was complex and deeply personal. Some held memorials, finally able to grieve in a way that had been denied to them for half a century. Others retreated into private mourning, unwilling to share a moment that felt too sacred, too painful to expose. For those without answers, the discovery was almost unbearable. It confirmed proximity without resolution. It suggested their children had been close, but not close enough to be found. The hope that had sustained them for decades now had to coexist with a new kind of uncertainty, one sharpened by the knowledge that answers were possible, just not guaranteed. The town struggled to absorb the implications. Conversations returned to places they had avoided for years. Infrastructure decisions, budget cuts, projects rushed or abandoned. The idea that progress itself could create danger if not carefully considered became impossible to ignore. People walked the streets differently now. They noticed storm drains, access panels, subtle shifts in elevation that hinted at what lay beneath. The ground no longer felt neutral. It felt layered, carrying both what was visible and what had been hidden. The discovery also reshaped memory. For years, the disappearance had been an open-ended story, defined by not knowing. Now that story had edges, uneven, incomplete, but real. The children were no longer just missing. Some were found. Some were partially accounted for. Some remained lost in a new way, their absence now tied to a place rather than a void. This shift was disorienting. The mystery had once been infinite, painful but abstract. Now it was finite in some places, painfully concrete. It forced people to imagine final moments they had spent decades trying not to picture. Investigators continued working, careful not to promise what they could not deliver. They revisited old files with new context. They re-interviewed witnesses, not because they expected fresh revelations, but because time had a way of loosening memories once locked by fear or loyalty. Some people spoke differently now, their words shaped by the knowledge that the truth had begun to surface. But even with renewed effort, the case resisted full resolution. The discovery answered one question decisively. The children had not vanished into nothing. They had been swallowed by something real, something constructed, something overlooked. What it could not answer was everything else. Why were those spaces accessible? Why were safeguards absent or ignored? Why were some children accounted for, and others not? Why had the sealing occurred without clear documentation? Each question branched into others, forming a web too complex to untangle completely. For a town that had waited 50 years, this partial truth was both a gift and a burden. It validated suspicion long dismissed. It justified grief long questioned. It proved that the search had not been in vain, only misdirected. But it also ensured that the story would never end cleanly. There would be no single headline that closed the case. No moment where everyone agreed that justice had been done, that peace had been restored. The discovery had shifted the narrative, not concluded it. In the end, what was found mattered deeply. But what was not found mattered just as much, because it left the town with final, unsettling understanding. Some mysteries do not resolve into clarity. They fracture. They linger. They offer just enough truth to change everything, and just enough absence to ensure that the silence never fully lifts. And for those who had lived half a century waiting, that might have been the most haunting discovery of all. Voices on the phone were careful, measured, as if tone alone could soften what words could not. After 50 years of waiting, of living inside uncertainty, the confirmation arrived quietly, not with the force of revelation, but with the weight of finality. For those who lived long enough to hear it, knowing was not a moment of closure. It was a reckoning. Grief did not return the way it had existed before. It changed shape. For decades, these parents had lived with a specific kind of pain, the pain of not knowing. It was sharp, restless, fueled by imagination and hope in equal measure. When answers finally arrived, that pain did not disappear. It transformed into something heavier, slower, more grounded, a grief with edges. Some parents described it as finally being allowed to breathe, even though the air burned. They could stop wondering where their child was, stop imagining parallel lives unfolding somewhere else, stop scanning crowds for familiar faces that time had already erased. Knowing allowed them to place their grief somewhere real, somewhere finite. That mattered, even when it hurt. Others found the knowledge unbearable. They had survived for decades by believing, quietly, stubbornly, that their child might still be alive. That belief had not always been hopeful. Sometimes it was agonizing, but it had been theirs. To have it taken away at the end of a lifetime felt cruel, like learning how a story ends after spending years inside its uncertainty. There was no universal reaction. One mother asked for privacy and never spoke publicly again. One father gave an interview and then disappeared from view. Some families held small memorials, intimate and restrained, attended only by those who had carried the weight alongside them. Others refused ceremonies altogether, unwilling to perform grief in a way that felt scripted. The idea of closure proved elusive. People outside the town spoke of it easily, as if it were a switch that could be flipped once answers appeared. But for those who had waited 50 years, closure was not an event. It was a process, uneven, personal, and often incomplete. Knowing what happened did not undo the years spent not knowing. It did not give back birthdays missed, futures imagined, conversations that never happened. It did not erase the guilt parents carried for things they had done, or not done, on the last morning they saw their child. Some parents wrestled with new questions. Had their child been afraid? Had they been alone? Had there been a moment where rescue felt possible? These questions had existed before, but now they felt sharper, more specific. Knowledge narrowed the imagination, forcing it to focus on fewer, more painful possibilities. For those whose children were not accounted for, The pain took on a different quality. They lived with a new kind of absence, one defined by proximity. Their children had likely been close, perhaps even in the same space as those who were found. But likely was not certainty, and certainty was what they had waited for. The discovery had moved the boundary, but it had not crossed it. That partial knowing felt almost worse than before, because now the mystery had a shape, and their children still lay outside it. Age added another layer of complexity. Many parents were elderly by the time answers emerged. Their bodies were tired, their energy limited. Grief, once endured through sheer endurance, now demanded a different kind of strength, one that had to coexist with declining health and fading memory. Some wondered aloud whether it would have been kinder not to know. Others said they would have waited another 50 years, if that was what it took. There was no consensus, only individual reckonings shaped by decades of loss. The town watched these parents with a mix of respect and helplessness. They had become symbols over time, faces attached to an unsolved case, names mentioned in anniversary articles. But now, they were just people again, navigating something no one should have to experience at any age, let alone at the end of a lifetime. The community tried to support them awkwardly. There were cards, quiet visits, casseroles delivered with uncertain hands. Words felt insufficient. What do you say to someone who has waited half a century for news that rewrites their entire emotional history? Many parents spoke about one unexpected thing: relief at no longer being questioned. For years, they had endured speculation about their parenting, their choices, their reactions. Some had been subtly blamed for allowing their children to walk alone, for trusting the town too much. The discovery shifted that narrative. It confirmed that what happened had been beyond their control. That validation mattered. It did not erase guilt, but it loosened its grip. As time passed after the announcement, the intensity faded, not the grief, but the attention. The world moved on again, as it always does. But for the parents, something had changed permanently. They no longer lived in a state of suspended waiting. They lived in a state of knowing and learning how to exist inside it. Some found peace in small ways, visiting memorials, speaking their child's name aloud without hesitation, allowing themselves to imagine an end rather than an endless maybe. Others struggled, their grief resurfacing in waves that felt both new and achingly familiar. What united them was the understanding that closure, if it existed at all, did not look like resolution. It looked like endurance refined by truth. For those who lived long enough to know, the answers did not close the wound. They changed it, and in that change, they found something fragile and complicated. Not peace exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement that the waiting at least had finally ended. It curves the same way it always has. Bends gently past houses that have been repainted more times than anyone can count. Passage trees are taller now, their roots deeper, their branches stretching over the pavement like quiet witnesses. To someone who doesn't know the story, it is unremarkable. Just another route children take to school. Just another piece of infrastructure doing its job. In the mornings, backpacks still bounce against small backs. Shoes still scuff the ground. Conversations drift and fade as children split off toward different streets. Parents still stand in doorways, watching until figures disappear around corners, trusting the distance the way they always have, though that trust is no longer effortless, because this road remembers. It remembers the morning when 17 children walked it and never finished the journey. It remembers the silence that followed, the years layered on top of that silence, the answers that arrived too late and not completely. Memory does not fade evenly. Some places hold on to it more tightly than others. The town learned to live with that knowledge. Life did not stop, even when it felt like it should have. New generations grew up hearing the story in fragments, never all at once, never in full detail. It surfaced in warnings and pauses, in the way adults reacted when a child was late getting home. It existed as atmosphere rather than narrative. Children learned instinctively that some questions were not meant to be pushed too hard. They sensed it in the way conversations changed when the past was mentioned, in the way older residents avoided certain streets at certain times of day, in the way adults still looked down at storm drains after heavy rain, as if checking that nothing had shifted. The town moved forward, but never fully turned its back. Memorials came and went. Plaques were debated, installed, revised. Some people wanted permanent markers. Others feared that too much remembrance would trap the town in grief. There was no solution that satisfied everyone, because memory is not a shared experience. It is deeply personal. What remained constant was the absence. Even after discoveries, even after partial answers, there were still 17 stories that never unfolded beyond childhood. Some were given endings. Others remained suspended. The imbalance lingered, a reminder that resolution does not always arrive evenly or fairly. Visitors sometimes asked if the town felt haunted. Residents rarely answered directly. Haunted implied something supernatural, something dramatic. What they lived with was quieter than that. It was an awareness, a low, steady understanding that ordinary places are capable of holding extraordinary pain, that a sidewalk can be both a path forward and a stopping point, that a shortcut can be harmless one day and catastrophic the next. The road to school became symbolic in ways no one would have chosen. It represented trust, given freely without hesitation. It represented routine, the comfort of repetition, and it represented the moment when both were shattered, not by violence anyone could see, but by disappearance, by the realization that safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. Years later, when parents walk their children along that same route, they do so with a careful balance. They don't tell the whole story. They don't want to pass down fear like an inheritance. But they also don't pretend nothing happened. They teach awareness instead of suspicion, presence instead of panic, a quieter vigilance shaped by memory rather than terror. The town does not want to be defined solely by what it lost, but it also refuses to forget. On certain mornings, cool ones, when the light falls just right, it's easy to imagine the past overlapping with the present. 17 figures walking ahead, slightly out of focus, just far enough away to feel unreachable, not as ghosts, but as echoes, possibilities that never fully disappeared, just changed form. This is how the story ends, not with a final answer, not with justice neatly served or grief cleanly resolved, but with continuation, with a road that is still walked, still trusted, still watched a little more closely than before. The town understands now that disappearance is not always dramatic. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in routine, leaving behind nothing but questions and a long work of learning how to live without certainty. Sometimes the most haunting mysteries are not the ones that explode into chaos, but the ones that slip into spaces between everyday moments and refuse to leave. 17 children left for school. The town never truly stopped walking with them. And every morning, as the road fills with new footsteps, the past moves alongside the present, unseen, unresolved, but never entirely gone.